The dust from the stagecoach still hung in the air when Grace Fairchild stepped down onto the wooden planks of St. Louis's Main Street. Her worn leather satchel clutched tight against her chest, and wondered if she had made the most foolish decision of her 23 years. The Missouri heat pressed against her dark wool traveling dress, making her long for the cool Massachusetts mornings she had left behind 6 weeks ago. But she lifted her chin and surveyed the bustling frontier town with determination burning in her chest. Her father had called her reckless when she announced her intention to come west and teach. Her mother had wept for 3 days straight, but Grace had felt the calling so strongly she could not ignore it, even when her comfortable life back east seemed infinitely more sensible than this dusty, rough settlement on the edge of civilization. The year was 1878, and St. Louis had grown from its trading post roots into a sprawling city perched on the western bank of the Mississippi River, a gateway to territories beyond. Grace had corresponded with Reverend Thomas Whitman for nearly 6 months before making the journey, his letters describing the desperate need for someone to educate the frontier children who ran wild through the streets while their parents worked from dawn until dusk, just to survive. The church had funds for a teacher, he wrote, but no one willing to make the journey west, no one willing to leave behind the comforts of established cities for the uncertainty of frontier life. Grace had read those letters by candlelight in her bedroom, feeling something stir inside her that had been dormant for too long. She had taught at a small school in Boston for 3 years, watching privileged children learn their letters and numbers with bored expressions, and she had felt her soul withering. When she read about children who had never held a book, who could not write their own names, who had no knowledge of Scripture or salvation, she knew she had found her purpose. Now, standing in the late afternoon sun with the Mississippi River flowing brown and endless beyond the buildings, she wondered if her certainty had been naive optimism. The street teemed with activity that would have scandalized her Boston neighbors. Rough-looking men in dusty clothes led horses through the mud-caked roads. Women in practical dresses hurried between shops with baskets on their arms, and the air rang with shouts in languages she could not identify. The buildings were a mix of brick structures and wooden frames, some freshly painted and others weathered gray by sun and rain. Miss Fairchild, a thin man in a black suit, approached her, his collar marking him as clergy. "I am Reverend Whitman. Welcome to St. Louis." Grace shook his extended hand, relieved to see a friendly face. "Thank you for meeting me, Reverend. I apologize for my appearance. The journey was quite arduous. Think nothing of it, my dear. You must be exhausted. Let me help you with your trunk." He gestured to the driver, unloading her belongings. "Mrs. Henderson has prepared a room for you at the boarding house. It is simple but clean, and you will find her cooking far superior to what you have endured on the road." As they walked through the streets, Reverend Whitman pointed out the landmarks Grace would need to know. The church stood at the corner of Fifth and Locust, a modest wooden structure with a bell tower that leaned slightly to the left. The general store occupied the ground floor of a brick building, with the doctor's office above it. The boarding house sat 2 blocks from the church, a 2-story frame building painted white with green shutters. "Tomorrow is Sunday," Reverend Whitman said as they climbed the boarding house steps. "I thought perhaps you might like to observe the children before taking charge of their instruction. Get a sense of what you are facing." "I would appreciate that," Grace said, though fatigue made her voice thin. She wanted nothing more than to collapse onto a bed, but she forced herself to remain attentive. "How many children typically attend?" "It varies. On a good Sunday, perhaps 15. During planting or harvest, fewer. Many of the families work 7 days a week just to survive." They see little value in education when there is work to be done. He paused at the door. I must warn you, Miss Fairchild, these children are not like the ones you taught in Boston. They are rough, undisciplined, and many have never sat still for a lesson in their lives. The last teacher we had lasted only 3 weeks before returning east. Grace squared her shoulders. I did not come all this way to be frightened off by high spirits, Reverend. I believe every child deserves the chance to learn, regardless of their circumstances. I pray you feel the same in a month's time, he said, but his smile was kind. That night, Grace lay in her narrow bed listening to unfamiliar sounds. Somewhere below, men's voices rose in argument, then faded. A piano played badly in what she assumed was a saloon down the street. The river itself seemed to whisper against its banks, a constant rushing that both soothed and unsettled her. She thought of her mother's tearful goodbye, her father's stern warning that she would come running home before summer's end. She would prove them wrong. She had to. Sunday morning arrived with the clanging of the church bell, and Grace dressed in her best navy dress with its high collar and modest bustle. She pinned her honey-colored hair into a tight bun and secured her hat with a pearl pin her grandmother had given her. When she entered the church, families were already gathering, men in their cleanest shirts and women in faded but carefully mended dresses. Children of all ages squirmed in the pews, their faces scrubbed but their clothes worn thin from hard use. Reverend Whitman preached about mercy and redemption, his voice carrying well in the small space, despite his slight build. Grace sat in the front pew and tried to focus on his words, but her attention kept drifting to the children. They ranged from toddlers who could barely sit still to teenagers who looked like they would rather be anywhere else. Several boys in the back pew kept pushing each other, their mothers reaching over to swat their legs when they grew too rowdy. After the service, the children filed into a room behind the sanctuary for Sunday school. Grace followed, her heart beating faster with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The room held wooden benches arranged in rows, a single chalkboard propped against the wall, and windows that let in bright morning light. A few battered primers sat stacked on a rickety table. Reverend Whitman stood at the front and raised his hands for silence. It took several attempts before the chattering children settled. Boys and girls, I want you to meet Miss Fairchild. She has come all the way from Boston to be your new teacher. 23 pairs of eyes turned to stare at Grace. She stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her. Good morning, children. I am very happy to meet all of you. A boy of about 10 with unruly brown hair raised his hand. Is Boston where all them fancy people live? Where all those fancy people live, Grace corrected gently. And yes, it is a large city back east. Can you ride a horse? A girl with red braids demanded. I am afraid I have not had much occasion to learn, Grace admitted. This provoked whispers and giggles. Reverend Whitman cleared his throat. Miss Fairchild will be teaching you reading, writing, arithmetic, and scripture. You will treat her with respect and obedience. Now, I will leave you in her capable hands. He retreated, and Grace suddenly found herself alone with nearly 24 frontier children whose expressions ranged from curious to openly skeptical. She took a deep breath and reached for the Bible she had brought. Who can tell me about David and Goliath? The lesson quickly deteriorated into chaos. The younger children could not sit still. The older ones whispered amongst themselves, and when Grace tried to get them to recite a psalm, half of them clearly did not know how to read. By the time parents arrived to collect their offspring an hour later, Grace's carefully pinned hair had come loose. Her voice was hoarse from trying to be heard over the din, and she felt utterly defeated. Reverend Whitman found her sitting on one of the benches after everyone had gone, her head in her hands. There, my dear. The first day is always the hardest." "They did not learn a single thing," Grace said, fighting back tears of frustration. "How can I teach children who will not even sit still long enough to listen?" "You must earn their respect first," he said. "These children have seen hardship that would break most adults. They do not trust easily, and they have no use for book learning that does not help them survive. You must show them why your lessons matter." Grace lifted her head. "Then I will need more time with them. 1 hour on Sunday is not enough." "The church can pay you for Sunday instruction only," Reverend Whitman said regretfully. "Most families cannot spare their children during the week." "Then I will teach for free on weekday evenings," Grace said firmly. "Surely the children can spare an hour after supper, and I will need help, someone who understands these children, who they respect." "I will ask among the congregation," he promised. That week, Grace prepared lessons with renewed determination. She visited the general store and spent some of her precious savings on slate boards and chalk. She rewrote her lesson plans to include practical examples that frontier children would understand. She practiced speaking louder, projecting her voice the way her own schoolteacher had taught her years ago. On Wednesday evening, she opened the church for the first weeknight lesson, not knowing if anyone would come. To her surprise, 8 children trickled in, including the brown-haired boy who had asked about Boston. She learned his name was Tommy, and his father worked loading cargo on the riverboats. A set of twins, Mary and Martha, came with their older sister watching over them. A few others whose names she scrambled to remember. Grace had prepared a lesson about the Good Samaritan, but she had written out the story on large sheets of paper she had tacked to the wall, with simple words and illustrations she had drawn herself. "Tonight, we are going to read this story together," she announced. "I will help you with the words you do not know." It went better than Sunday. With fewer children, she could give individual attention. Tommy struggled with longer words but attacked them with determination. The twins leaned against each other and shared a slate board, writing letters with exaggerated care. By the time she dismissed them an hour later, they had made it through the entire parable, and every child could tell her what it meant to be a neighbor. "You are getting better at this," a man's voice said from the doorway after the children left. Grace turned to find a tall figure silhouetted against the evening light. He stepped into the church, and she saw he was a cowboy of perhaps 26 or 27 years, with dark hair that curled over his collar and eyes that were an unexpected shade of green. He wore dusty range clothes and a battered hat he removed as he entered. His hands, she noticed, were calloused and scarred from hard work. "I am sorry, can I help you?" Grace asked, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look after teaching. "Name is Ryder Dalton," he said. "Reverend Whitman mentioned you could use some help with the children. I came to volunteer." Grace studied him skeptically. He did not look like someone who spent his time with children or in churches. His gun belt hung low on his hips, and his face had the weathered look of a man who spent his days in the saddle under the harsh sun. "That is very kind, Mr. Dalton, but I am not sure what help you could provide. I need someone who can assist with reading and scripture." "I can read," he said, sounding slightly offended, "and I know scripture well enough. My mother made sure of that before she passed." "I meant no offense," Grace said quickly. "I simply was not expecting someone of your profession to volunteer for Sunday school. What do you know about my profession?" There was an edge to his voice now. "I assumed from your appearance that you work with cattle," Grace said, lifting her chin. "There is no shame in honest work, Mr. Dalton." His expression softened slightly. "I work for the Harrison Ranch about 10 miles west of town, Been working cattle since I was 14 years old. But I grew up in these parts, and I know these children. I know which ones have fathers who drink too much, which ones go to bed hungry more nights than not, and which ones are just looking for someone to believe they are worth something. Grace felt something shift inside her chest. Why do you want to help? Ryder looked away, turning his hat in his hands. I was one of those children once, running wild because no one cared enough to show me a better way. A church teacher took an interest in me when I was about 12, taught me to read properly, showed me there was more to life than just surviving day to day. He passed a few years back, and I have been thinking I should give back what he gave me. He met her eyes again. But if you do not want my help, I understand. I know I do not look like much. Mr. Dalton, Grace said slowly, if you are willing to give your time to help these children, I would be grateful for your assistance. Can you come tomorrow evening? I will be here, he promised. After he left, Grace stood in the empty church and wondered what she had just agreed to. A rough-handed cowboy who wore his gun even to church volunteering to teach Sunday school was not what she had envisioned. But something in his eyes when he talked about the children told her he was sincere. And if she was honest, she needed all the help she could get. Ryder Dalton arrived the next evening before any children, his face freshly scrubbed and his hair still damp from washing. He had left his gun belt somewhere, Grace noticed, which touched her more than she expected. He looked younger without it, less dangerous, though his size and presence still filled the small room. I thought we could work on letters tonight, Grace said, showing him the primer she had laid out. Many of the children do not recognize them all yet. That makes sense, Ryder said. Should I take the older ones and you take the younger? Actually, I thought you might engage the older boys while I work with everyone else. They tend to disrupt the entire lesson when they grow bored. Ryder's mouth quirked. You want me to keep the troublemakers busy. I prefer to think of them as children with excess energy, Grace said primly, but she could not quite hide her smile. The children arrived in clusters, more than had come Wednesday. Apparently word had spread that the new teacher was actually interesting. Tommy brought his younger brother, a gap-toothed 6-year-old named Jack. The twins returned with 2 additional siblings. Others Grace had not yet met filed in, their eyes lighting up when they saw Ryder. Mr. Dalton, several boys shouted, rushing to him. Easy now, Ryder said, but he was grinning. You all know Miss Fairchild is in charge here. We are going to mind our manners and learn something tonight, understood? The boys nodded eagerly, and Grace felt a rush of gratitude. They respected him in a way they did not yet respect her. She called the younger children to the front, while Ryder took the older boys to the back benches. For the next hour, she led her group through letter recognition and simple words, while Ryder's deeper voice rumbled from the back as he worked with his group on reading passages from the Gospel of Luke. Afterwards, as they straightened the benches and collected the slate boards, Ryder said, You did well with them today. I could see they are starting to trust you. They trust you, Grace corrected. I am still the strange Eastern lady who does not know how to ride a horse. I could teach you if you want to learn. Grace looked up in surprise. That would hardly be proper, Mr. Dalton. We barely know each other. It is just riding, he said. And out here, being able to handle a horse is not a luxury, it is a necessity. What happens if you need to go somewhere and there is no wagon available, or if there is an emergency? He had a point, Grace had to admit. She had been completely dependent on others since arriving in St. Louis. I suppose a few lessons would be practical. Sunday afternoon, then, after church. I will bring a gentle mare from the ranch. Over the following weeks, a routine established itself. Grace taught Sunday school each week, with Ryder attending and helping manage the children. On Wednesday and Friday evenings, They held lessons that drew increasingly more students as word spread. And on Sunday afternoons, after the church service and dinner at the boarding house, Ryder arrived with a patient chestnut mare named Daisy and taught Grace to ride. Those Sunday lessons were torture at first. Grace had never been athletic, and sitting astride a horse felt unnatural and terrifying. Ryder was patient but firm, showing her how to hold the reins, how to sit in the saddle, how to communicate with the horse through subtle shifts in weight and pressure. "Stop tensing up," he said during their third lesson, riding beside her as they walked the horses along the river road. "Daisy can feel your fear. You have to trust her." "I am trying," Grace said through gritted teeth. "Why did you really come out here?" Ryder asked suddenly. "A woman like you could have stayed back east, married some wealthy merchant, had an easy life." "What makes you think that is the life I wanted?" Grace challenged. "Did not say it was. I am asking what you did want." Grace was quiet for a moment, focusing on keeping her seat as Daisy plodded along. "I wanted to matter," she finally said. "I wanted my life to mean something beyond attending parties and making polite conversation. I wanted to make a difference for people who needed it, not just teach privileged children who did not appreciate what they had." "And do you," Ryder asked, "feel like you matter here?" "I do not know yet," she admitted. "Some days I think I am reaching them. Other days I feel like I am completely lost and have no idea what I am doing." "That is just being alive," Ryder said. "No one knows what they are doing all the time. We are all just figuring it out as we go." "You seem very certain of yourself," Grace observed. Ryder laughed, a sound that surprised her with its genuine warmth. "Do I? Most days I feel like a fraud, a man who never went past basic schooling teaching children to read. A cowboy who barely makes enough to feed himself, pretending he has wisdom to offer." "You do have wisdom," Grace said firmly. "You understand these children in ways I never could, and they need someone like you, someone who has lived the life they are living and survived it." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, and Grace realized she had stopped being afraid. She was actually enjoying the rhythm of the horse beneath her, the warm afternoon sun, and the quiet companionship of the man beside her. "Your mother must have been a remarkable woman," Grace said. "To make sure you learned to read and know scripture despite the hardships you faced." Ryder's expression darkened. "She was. She died when I was 15. Fever took her in less than a week. After that, my father drank himself to death within a year, left me to fend for myself." "I am so sorry," Grace said softly. "It was a long time ago," but his voice was tight with old pain. "The teacher I mentioned, the one who helped me, his name was Samuel Morrison. He found me sleeping in the church one winter, and instead of running me off, he gave me work and kept teaching me. Made me promise I would make something of my life, that I would not waste the intelligence God gave me." He paused. "That is why I wanted to help you, to honor what he did for me." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "He would be proud of you, Mr. Dalton." "Ryder," he said, "if we are going to keep meeting like this, you might as well call me Ryder. Then you should call me Grace." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a recognition that their relationship had shifted from mere colleagues to something resembling friendship. Grace looked away first, suddenly flustered in a way that had nothing to do with the horse. As summer deepened into the full heat of a Missouri July, the Sunday school grew. What had started as a scattered 15 children became a consistent 25, with more asking to join the weeknight lessons. Grace had to recruit 2 more volunteers from the congregation, older women who remembered teaching their own children, to help manage all the students. But it was Ryder who remained her true partner in the endeavor. He arrived faithfully each teaching day, often coming straight from the ranch still dusty from work. The children adored him, and Grace watched with growing admiration as he showed infinite patience with their struggles. When Tommy could not grasp division, Ryder drew pictures of cattle that needed to be split between different pens. When Mary burst into tears over a difficult passage, Ryder sat beside her and sounded out each word until she could manage it herself. "You have a gift for this," Grace told him one evening as they cleaned up after a particularly successful lesson. 20 children had recited Psalm 23 together without a single mistake. "Or maybe I just remember what it felt like to struggle," Ryder said. "No one is born knowing these things, Grace. We all need someone to believe in us until we can believe in ourselves." Grace set down the primers she had been stacking and looked at him. Really looked at him. Over the past 2 months, she had come to know the man beneath the rough exterior. She knew he sent half his wages to a widow in town whose husband had died in a ranching accident. She knew he had memorized entire passages of scripture because his mother had made it a game when he was small. She knew he was gentle with animals and children, fierce in defense of those weaker than himself, and carried a deep well of loneliness he tried to hide behind jokes and easy smiles. And somewhere along the way, without meaning to, she had fallen in love with him. The realization hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. This was not the refined courtship she had imagined for herself. No proper gentleman calling at her father's house with flowers and poetry. This was a rough-handed cowboy who smelled of horses and leather, who would never fit into Boston society, who represented everything her parents had warned her against, and she did not care one bit. "Grace," Ryder's voice pulled her back. "Are you all right? You look flushed." "I am fine," she managed. "Just tired. It has been a long day." "Let me walk you back to the boarding house," he offered. They walked through the summer twilight, the air finally cooling after the oppressive heat of the day. St. Louis was settling into evening, lamps being lit in windows, the sound of a fiddle playing somewhere down by the river docks. Grace was intensely aware of Ryder beside her, his arm occasionally brushing hers as they navigated the wooden walkway. "I have been meaning to ask you something," Ryder said as they neared the boarding house. "There is an Independence Day celebration next week, picnic during the day, dancing in the evening. Would you allow me to escort you?" Grace's heart hammered. "Are you asking to court me, Ryder?" He stopped walking and turned to face her, his green eyes serious in the fading light. "I am. I know I am not the kind of man you probably imagined for yourself. I do not have much to offer except hard work and an honest heart. But these past months working beside you, getting to know you, I have come to care for you deeply. More than is probably wise for a cowboy who should know better." "Why should you know better?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because you are educated and refined and come from a good family back east. Because I am just a hired hand who will probably never own more than the horse I ride and the clothes on my back. Because you deserve better than what I can give you." Grace stepped closer to him, close enough that she could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the fear of rejection that he was trying to hide. "Do you want to know what I think you are, Ryder Dalton?" He swallowed hard but nodded. "I think you are one of the best men I have ever known. I think you have more genuine faith than half the people who sit in church every Sunday. I think you understand grace in a way that most people never will, because you have had to receive it and give it in equal measure just to survive. And I think I would be honored to attend the celebration with you." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise, bright and full of wonder. "Really, really," she confirmed. He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle around hers. "I will do right by you, Grace, I promise." "I know you will." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it softly, a gesture so old-fashioned and courtly that it made her breath catch. Then he stepped back, settling his hat on his head. "I will call for you at noon next Sunday." Grace watched him walk away into the gathering darkness, her hand still tingling where his lips had touched it, and felt joy bubble up inside her. She was courting a cowboy in Missouri, teaching frontier children, living a life her parents would consider scandalous, and she had never been happier. The Independence Day celebration was everything Ryder had promised and more. The entire town turned out for the event, families spreading blankets along the riverbank for the picnic, children running wild with excitement. Grace wore her best summer dress, pale yellow cotton with white lace at the collar and cuffs, and Ryder arrived at the boarding house in clean clothes with his hair carefully combed, looking nervous and pleased. They found a spot near a large oak tree and spread the blanket Grace had brought. Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house owner, had packed them a basket with fried chicken, biscuits, potato salad, and apple pie. Other families called out greetings, and Grace noticed several knowing looks sent their way. Apparently, news that the teacher and the cowboy were courting had spread through the community. "You mind that people are talking?" Ryder asked, following her gaze. "Let them talk," Grace said. "I am proud to be here with you." After they ate, they walked along the river, joining other couples strolling in the summer heat. Ryder pointed out landmarks and told her stories about growing up in St. Louis when it was smaller and wilder. Grace talked about Boston and her family, finding herself able to share memories without the ache of homesickness that had plagued her first weeks here. "You miss it?" Ryder asked. "Your old life?" "Sometimes I miss my mother's cooking," Grace admitted, "and I miss my younger sister. But I do not miss the life itself. I felt trapped there, like I was living someone else's idea of what my life should be. Here, I am building something that is mine. And after, when the school year ends and a new batch of children needs teaching, will you stay?" Grace looked up at him, shading her eyes against the sun. "Is there a reason I should stay, Ryder?" "I hope so," he said quietly. "I hope I am giving you a reason." Before she could respond, a commotion near the riverbank drew their attention. A crowd had gathered and someone was shouting. Ryder's hand went instinctively to his hip, but he had not worn his gun to the celebration. They hurried over to find Tommy standing knee-deep in the river, his younger brother Jack thrashing in the water several feet away. "He cannot swim," Tommy was screaming. "Jack cannot swim." Ryder did not hesitate. He plunged into the river, his boots and clothes immediately soaked. The Mississippi current was stronger than it looked, and Grace watched with her heart in her throat as Ryder fought his way to the boy. Jack had gone under once and came up sputtering and terrified. Ryder grabbed him just as he went under again, hauling him up and tucking the boy against his chest as he struggled back to shore. Several men waded in to help, and soon Ryder was dragging himself and Jack onto the muddy bank. The boy was coughing and crying but alive. Tommy threw himself at them both, sobbing apologies. Their mother arrived, white-faced and shaking, pulling both boys into her arms. "Thank you," she kept saying to Ryder through her tears. "Thank you, thank you." Ryder just nodded, bent over with his hands on his knees, breathing hard. Grace pushed through the crowd and touched his shoulder. "Are you hurt?" "I am fine," he gasped. "Just need a minute." But when he straightened, she saw the scrape on his forehead where something in the river had struck him, blood mixing with the water dripping from his hair. Without thinking, she pulled her handkerchief from her sleeve and pressed it to the wound. Ryder's hand came up to cover hers, holding it there, and their eyes met. "You are bleeding," she said unnecessarily. "It is nothing," he assured her, but he did not move her hand away. Around them, the crowd began to disperse, the crisis over. Someone brought Ryder a blanket to dry off with. The boy's mother thanked him 3 more times before finally leading her sons away, Tommy still clinging to Jack. Grace and Ryder stood together in the aftermath, her hand still pressed to his forehead, his fingers warm over hers. "That was incredibly brave," Grace said. "That was incredibly stupid," Ryder corrected. "I should have looked before jumping in. The current was stronger than I expected." "But you saved him." "Only just." He lowered their hands but did not let go of hers. "Grace, if something had happened to me in there, if the current had taken me under, I need you to know that these past months have been the best of my life. Getting to know you, working beside you, watching you love these children who have nothing and give them hope. You are extraordinary. Ryder, I love you," he said. "I know it is too soon and too fast, and I have no right to say it when I have so little to offer you, but I love you and I needed to say it at least once." Grace felt tears spill down her cheeks. "It is not too soon and it is not too fast, and you have every right to say it because I love you too. I have loved you for weeks now and was too afraid to admit it." He pulled her close, wrapping the blanket around them both, and kissed her. It was not her first kiss, but it was the first one that mattered, the first one that felt like coming home. His lips were cold from the river but warmed quickly, and Grace melted into him, not caring that they were in public or that his clothes were soaking her dress. Nothing mattered except this moment, this man, and the love that had grown between them like something wild and unstoppable. When they finally broke apart, Ryder was grinning despite the blood still trickling down his temple. "I am getting you all wet." "I do not care," Grace said, laughing and crying at the same time. "I do not care about anything except that you are safe and you love me and we are here together." "Come on," he said, taking her hand. "Let me get cleaned up, and then I want to dance with you tonight until your feet hurt and you cannot remember ever living without me." The evening dancing was held in a large barn on the edge of town. Lanterns strung from the rafters and a makeshift stage at one end where a group of musicians played fiddle, guitar, and banjo. The music was lively and loud, nothing like the refined balls Grace had attended in Boston, and she loved every chaotic minute of it. Ryder, despite his rough exterior, danced surprisingly well, spinning her through reels and waltzes and dances she did not know the names of but followed through laughter and trust. Between dances, they stood outside in the cooling night air, sharing a dipper of water from the barrel and watching fireflies drift through the darkness. Other couples did the same, and Grace saw her Sunday school students running between the adults, drunk on sugar and freedom. "When I was young," Ryder said, his arm around her waist, "I used to watch the Independence Day dances from outside, too poor to have decent clothes to come in. I would imagine what it would be like to be inside, to have someone to dance with, to belong somewhere." He looked down at her. "I never imagined anything this good. You belong everywhere I am," Grace said. "You must know that by now." "I am beginning to," he admitted. "You make me believe things I stopped believing a long time ago, that I am worth something. That I can be more than just a hired hand drifting from ranch to ranch. That I deserve happiness." "You deserve all the happiness in the world," Grace said fiercely. "And I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you know it. Is that a proposal, Miss Fairchild?" Ryder asked, his eyes twinkling. Grace blushed. "I think traditional roles suggest you should be the one proposing." "Traditional roles never did suit me much," Ryder said, but he grew serious, taking both her hands in his. "Grace Fairchild, I do not have a ring yet, and I am standing here in clothes that still smell like river water, but I cannot wait another minute. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life loving you and supporting your work and trying to be worthy of you?" "You are already worthy of me," Grace said. "And yes, Ryder Dalton, I will marry you. I will marry you and love you and build a life with you here on this frontier, and I will never regret leaving Boston because it brought me to you." He kissed her again, sweeter this time, full of promise and joy. Around them, other people noticed and began to cheer and clap. Grace broke away, laughing and embarrassed, but Ryder just grinned and pulled her back into the barn where he announced their engagement to the entire assembly. The musicians struck up a celebratory tune, and Grace found herself swept into congratulations and well wishes from people she barely knew, but who welcomed her as one of their own now. Late that night, when Ryder finally walked her back to the boarding house, they sat on the porch steps and talked about the future. Ryder wanted to save enough money to buy a small piece of land where they could build a house. Grace wanted to expand the school, maybe even make it an official weekday institution if they could find the funding. They talked about children of their own someday and what values they would instill in them, and how they would build a life that honored both their pasts. "I need to write to my parents," Grace said. "They will not understand, but I owe them the truth." "Will they come to the wedding?" Ryder asked. "I doubt it. My father will be disappointed that I am not marrying someone he chose. My mother will worry that I am throwing my life away." She squeezed his hand. "But they will be wrong. This is not throwing my life away. This is finally living it the way I was meant to." "I will do everything I can to make you happy," Ryder promised. "You already do," Grace assured him. They were married 6 weeks later in the same church where they had first worked together, surrounded by their Sunday school students and the community that had embraced them both. Grace wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Henderson helped her sew, with wildflowers in her hair that the children had picked that morning. Ryder wore a new suit that he had saved for weeks to buy, looking handsome and nervous and completely perfect. Reverend Whitman performed the ceremony with tears in his eyes, calling them an example of what faith and dedication could build. The children sang a hymn they had learned, slightly off-key but enthusiastic. When Ryder kissed his bride, Tommy and Jack Wolf whistled until their mother swatted them quiet, and everyone laughed. The reception was held in the churchyard, tables laden with dishes that families had contributed. Grace met ranch hands who worked with Ryder, women from the congregation who had become her friends, and endless children who had stories about what Miss Grace and Mr. Ryder had taught them. She had never felt more loved or more certain that she was exactly where she belonged. As the sun began to set, Ryder pulled her away from the crowd for a private moment. They stood under the oak tree where they had picnicked on Independence Day, his arms around her waist, her head against his chest. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Happier than I knew it was possible to be," Grace said honestly. "This morning I was Grace Fairchild, a spinster schoolteacher from Boston. Tonight I am Grace Dalton, married to the man I love with a purpose and a home and a future full of possibilities." "Grace Dalton," Ryder repeated, testing the sound of it. "I like that very much." "So do I," she said. "So do I." They had rented a small house on the edge of town, 2 rooms and a kitchen with a vegetable garden plot out back. It was not much, but they had cleaned and painted it together in the weeks before the wedding. Hanging curtains Grace sewed and arranging the few pieces of furniture they had been given as wedding gifts. When Ryder carried her over the threshold that night, Grace looked around at their humble home and felt only contentment. The first months of marriage were an adjustment. Ryder worked long hours at the ranch, leaving before dawn and returning after dark during the busy season. Grace continued teaching Sunday school and had started weekday classes for younger children whose parents could spare them for a few hours. They were building their lives piece by piece, learning each other's habits and quirks, figuring out how to be partners in every sense of the word. Sometimes Grace caught herself marveling at the path that had brought her here. If she had listened to her parents, she would be in Boston now, probably married to some merchant's son, teaching privileged children who did not appreciate her, living a life of comfortable emptiness. Instead, she was in Missouri, married to a cowboy who loved her fiercely, teaching children who hung on her every word because education was a precious gift they had never expected to receive. "You look thoughtful," Ryder said one evening as they sat on their small porch, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and gold. "Regretting your choices?" "Never," Grace said immediately. "I was just thinking about how grateful I am that I was brave enough to come west, to take a chance on a life that terrified me." "I am the grateful one," Ryder said. "You gave me something I thought I would never have, a home, a family, a reason to build something instead of just drifting." "We gave each other those things," Grace corrected. "That winter was hard." Ryder's hours at the ranch lessened, but money grew tighter with less work available. Grace took in sewing to supplement their income, her fingers cramping as she worked by lamplight to finish shirts and dresses for paying customers. The little house was cold despite the wood stove they kept burning, and there were nights when they went to bed hungry to save food for the next day. But they were happy. Grace had never understood how people could be poor and happy until she lived it herself. Every meal they shared felt precious. Every evening spent reading together by the fire was a gift. Every Sunday when they stood in front of the church and taught children about grace and faith and perseverance, they were living those lessons themselves. "You know what grace really means now, do not you?" Grace asked Ryder one Sunday after a particularly good lesson where every child had grasped the concept of unmerited favor. "I think I am starting to," Ryder admitted. "It is not just God's love despite our unworthiness. It is also the daily choice to extend that same love to others. To see people not for what they are but for what they could become. To give without expecting return." "You have always known that," Grace said. "You have been showing grace to these children from the beginning, seeing their potential instead of their rough behavior, believing in them when no one else did." "You taught me that," Ryder said. "You came out here and saw worth in children that society had written off. You saw worth in me when I was just a cowboy who wandered into your church." "We taught each other," Grace said. "That is what love does. It teaches us to be better versions of ourselves." Spring brought relief and new challenges. The ranch needed more hands as the cattle were prepared for market, so Ryder's wages increased. Grace discovered she was pregnant, news that filled them both with joy and terror. A baby would mean more expenses, less income when Grace had to stop teaching, and 1,000 fears about whether they could provide everything a child needed. "We will manage," Ryder said, his hand on her still flat stomach. "People out here have been raising children on nothing but love and determination for generations. We will do the same." "I want our child to have opportunities," Grace said. "Education, books, a chance to become whoever they want to be." "They will," Ryder promised. "Because they will have you as a mother, and you will make sure of it." Grace continued teaching as long as she could, finally stepping back in her 7th month when climbing the church steps left her breathless and dizzy. The congregation threw her a celebration, and the children made drawings and cards expressing their love and thanks. Tommy, now 12 and reading at a level that would have seemed impossible 2 years ago, stood up and gave a speech about how Miss Grace had changed all their lives. "Before you came," he said, stumbling over the words but determined to say them, "I thought I was just going to grow up to work the docks like my pa. Nothing wrong with that, but it was all I could see for myself. You taught me to read, and that opened up the whole world. Now I know I can be anything I want if I am willing to work for it. You gave me hope, Miss Grace. You and Mr. Ryder both." Grace cried through the entire speech, and Ryder had to hold her up as emotion and pregnancy made her unsteady. After everyone left, they sat in the quiet church and absorbed what they had built together. "We did something good here," Ryder said. "Something that is going to last long after we are gone." "We did," Grace agreed, "and we are going to keep doing it. This is just the beginning." Their son was born on a sweltering August morning in 1880, after 12 hours of labor that left Grace exhausted but elated. Ryder held the tiny, red-faced baby with a look of wonder that made Grace's heart overflow. They named him Samuel, after the teacher who had saved Ryder all those years ago. "Samuel Dalton," Ryder whispered, his finger stroking the baby's tiny hand. "You are going to have the childhood I never did. You are going to grow up knowing you are loved and wanted and capable of anything." Grace watched her husband with their son and fell in love with him all over again. This rough man who had lived such a hard life, who had known hunger and abandonment and grief, holding their baby with infinite gentleness and making promises he would break himself to keep. The first year of Samuel's life was exhausting but joyful. Grace taught from home, taking in 3 students at a time for reading lessons while Samuel napped. Ryder continued working at the ranch but came home every evening to hold his son and help with whatever needed doing. They had so little in terms of material wealth, but their home was filled with love and laughter and the determination to build something lasting. When Samuel was 6 months old, Reverend Whitman approached them with a proposal. "The church has been discussing establishing a proper school, open 5 days a week for all children. We have raised enough funds to build a schoolhouse and pay a teacher's salary. Grace, we want you to be that teacher. And Ryder, we want you to help oversee the building construction and serve as a trustee." Grace and Ryder looked at each other, hardly daring to believe it. "A real school?" Grace asked. "A real school," Reverend Whitman confirmed. "You two have proven what is possible. Enrollment in Sunday school has tripled since you started teaching. Children who could not write their names 2 years ago are now reading full passages. Parents have told me their children come home excited about learning, asking questions, wanting to understand the world around them. We want to expand that, give every child in St. Louis the chance at an education." "Yes," Grace said immediately. "Yes, of course we will do it." The schoolhouse was built that spring, a sturdy wooden structure with real desks, a large chalkboard, and windows that let in plenty of light. Ryder worked on the construction every spare moment he had, alongside other men from the church and community. When it was finished, they held a dedication ceremony, and Grace stood at the front of the empty classroom with tears streaming down her face. "This is what we came here for," she said to Ryder, who stood beside her with Samuel in his arms. "This is what all the hardship was leading to." "This is just the beginning," Ryder said. "Imagine what we can build in 10 years, 20, the children we can reach, the lives we can change." The school opened that fall with 32 students ranging from age 5 to 15. Grace hired 2 assistants to help manage different age groups, and Ryder continued volunteering every afternoon after ranch work to help the older students with reading and mathematics. Word spread, and families who lived miles outside town began bringing their children in for the chance at education. Years passed in a blur of teaching and learning and growing. Samuel grew into a bright, curious boy who loved books as much as his mother and horses as much as his father. Grace gave birth to twin daughters when Samuel was 3, and the girls were a whirlwind from the start, keeping both parents constantly busy. Ryder had been promoted to ranch foreman, a position that paid better and gave him more regular hours. They saved enough to add 2 rooms to their house, giving the children proper bedrooms. The school continued to thrive and expand. Students who had graduated stayed in touch, writing letters about jobs they had gotten or further education they were pursuing. Tommy became a teacher himself, taking a position in a small town farther west. Mary, one of the red-headed twins from Grace's first lessons, went on to become a nurse. Jack, the boy Ryder had saved from drowning, credited that day with his determination to become a doctor, and he sent Grace updates on his progress through medical school. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ryder surprised Grace with a picnic at the same oak tree where they had spent Independence Day all those years ago. The children were with Mrs. Henderson for the afternoon, and it was just the two of them, older and more tired than they had been as newlyweds, but deeper in love. "Do you ever wonder how different your life would be if you had stayed in Boston?" Ryder asked, pouring her a glass of lemonade. "Sometimes," Grace admitted. "But I cannot imagine any version of that life that would be better than this. Yes, we have struggled. Yes, there have been hard times, but we have built something real and lasting. We have loved deeply. We have made a difference." She took his hand. "I would choose this life with you 1,000 times over." "I thank God every day that you walked off that stagecoach," Ryder said. "I was just drifting through life before you, existing but not really living. You gave me purpose. You taught me what grace really means, not just as a concept but as a way of living." "We taught each other," Grace said, the same words she had spoken years ago still true. "That is what love does." They watched the sun set over the Mississippi, the river that had brought Grace to this place and this life. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of St. Louis growing and changing, but here in this moment, everything was perfect and complete. The children grew, and the school grew with them. By the time Samuel was ready for advanced education, there were over 100 students attending the school Grace had founded. Other teachers had been hired, but Grace remained the headmistress, overseeing curriculum and working with the most challenging students. Ryder had eventually saved enough to buy a small ranch of his own, nothing large but enough to support their family and employ a few workers. They had lived the life Grace had dreamed of that day she stepped off the stagecoach, terrified and determined in equal measure. They had faced hardships and celebrated triumphs. They had buried Reverend Whitman when he passed peacefully in his sleep at age 76, and they had danced at the weddings of countless students they had taught. They had watched their children grow into capable, compassionate adults who knew the value of education and service. But through it all, the core remained the same. Every Sunday, even as their responsibilities grew, Grace and Ryder taught Sunday school together. They stood in front of new generations of children and talked about grace and faith and the transformative power of love. They told stories about their own journey, about taking chances and trusting God and believing in the potential of every person. On a crisp October morning in 1895, Grace stood at the window of the schoolhouse watching students arrive. She was 40 years old now, her honey-colored hair streaked with gray, her face lined from years of sun and wind and laughter. Ryder came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how far we have come," Grace said. "About how that terrified woman who arrived here 17 years ago barely recognizes herself now. About how every hard decision and every moment of doubt led to this." She gestured at the students filling the schoolyard, their voices raised in play and conversation. "We did this, Ryder, together." "You did this," Ryder corrected. "You had the courage to come west, to see worth in children everyone else had overlooked, to believe in the transformative power of education. I just helped." "You did more than help," Grace said firmly, turning in his arms to face him. "You taught me what grace really looks like in action. Not just talking about faith, but living it. not just believing people can change, but giving them the tools and support to actually do it. You saved my life as surely as you saved Jack from that river, even if you did it more slowly. We saved each other, Ryder said, kissing her forehead. That is what love does. Grace smiled at him, using her words back to her. Yes, that is exactly what love does. The bell rang, calling students to class, and Grace straightened her skirts and prepared to face another day of teaching. But before she left the safety of Ryder's arms, she said, "I love you, Ryder Dalton. Thank you for taking a chance on a frightened Eastern woman who did not know how to ride a horse." "I love you, Grace Dalton," Ryder replied. "Thank you for teaching a rough cowboy about grace." They walked to the school together, hand in hand, ready to face whatever the day brought. Behind them, 17 years of memories. Before them, a future full of possibilities. And between them, a love that had grown from a shared desire to serve into something deep and unshakable. A partnership that had changed not just their lives, but the lives of hundreds of children who had passed through their care. In the years that followed, Grace and Ryder became institutions in St. Louis. The school continued to grow until it was officially recognized by the state and received public funding. Grace trained dozens of teachers who went on to found schools in other frontier towns, spreading her philosophy of education that valued every child regardless of their circumstances. Ryder's ranch became profitable enough that he was able to sponsor scholarships for students who wanted to pursue higher education, but lacked the means. Their children grew and found their own paths. Samuel became a lawyer who specialized in advocating for poor families, carrying on his parents' mission in a different way. The twin girls both became teachers, one staying in St. Louis to work at their mother's school and the other traveling west to teach in the territories. Grace and Ryder had 4 grandchildren by the time they reached their 50s, and they delighted in passing on the lessons they had learned to this new generation. But no matter how busy life became, Sunday mornings were sacred. Grace and Ryder stood in front of the Sunday school class, older and slower but no less passionate, and taught children about grace. They told the story of their own love, how a determined teacher from Boston and a rough cowboy from Missouri had found each other and built something beautiful from faith and hard work. "Grace is not something you earn," Ryder would say, his voice still strong despite his years. "It is a gift freely given. All you have to do is accept it and then pass it on to others. Grace is seeing potential where others see problems," Grace would add. "It is believing in someone until they can believe in themselves. It is loving without condition and serving without expectation of reward." The children would listen, much as children had listened 17 years ago, and many of them would carry those lessons into their own lives, continuing the cycle of grace that Grace and Ryder had started. On a warm summer evening in 1905, Grace and Ryder sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold. They were both 60 and 54 respectively now, their hands gnarled with arthritis, their bodies marked by a lifetime of hard work. But they were still together, still in love, still committed to the work they had started so many years ago. "You have any regrets?" Grace asked, her head resting on Ryder's shoulder. "Not a single one," Ryder said. "Every choice I made led me to you. Every hardship taught me something I needed to know. Every moment of doubt was overcome by faith and love. I thought I came west to teach frontier children," Grace said softly. "But really, I came to learn. I learned about grace from you, about perseverance from the children, about faith from this community that welcomed me. I learned that love is not about comfort or security. It is about choosing someone every single day and building a life together one moment at a time. "You taught me that I was worth loving," Ryder said, his voice thick with emotion even after all these years. "I thought I was just a cowboy with nothing to offer. You showed me I had more to give than I ever imagined. You made me believe in myself." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Inside the house, their daughter was visiting with her husband and children, the sound of laughter drifting through the open windows. Tomorrow there would be Sunday school to teach, lessons to plan, grandchildren to spoil. But tonight, there was just this. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life full of purpose and love. "I would not change a single thing," Grace said finally. "Neither would I," Ryder agreed. And as stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, they held hands and gave thanks for the journey that had brought them together, for the love that had sustained them through hardship, and for the grace that had transformed two lonely people into a partnership that would echo through generations. The Sunday school they had started continued long after Grace and Ryder were gone, taught by their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, each generation passing on the lessons about grace and faith and the transformative power of believing in people. The school Grace founded became one of the most respected institutions in Missouri, known for taking students that other schools rejected and helping them reach their full potential. Scholarship funds established in Grace and Ryder's names sent hundreds of students to college over the decades. But perhaps their greatest legacy was the love they had shared, the example they had set of what a true partnership could be. They had taught through their words, but even more through their actions, showing that grace was not just a theological concept, but a practical way of living. They had demonstrated that love was not about finding someone perfect, but about choosing to see the best in someone and helping them become who they were meant to be. Years after their deaths, when their great-granddaughter stood in front of a Sunday school class in California and told the story of how her great-grandmother Grace had come west to teach frontier children, and how a cowboy named Ryder had volunteered to help and learned about grace, the children listened with rapt attention. And some of them, inspired by that story, went on to become teachers themselves, to volunteer in their communities, to show grace to others who needed it. The ripples spread outward, generation after generation, proof that two people committed to love and service could change the world, one child, one lesson, one act of grace at a time. Grace Fairchild had stepped off that stagecoach in 1878 with nothing but determination and a calling, and she had found everything she never knew she needed. Ryder Dalton had walked into a church looking to honor the memory of a teacher who had saved him, and he had discovered salvation of a different kind. Together, they had built something that lasted far beyond their own lifetimes. They had taught about grace, but more importantly, they had lived it. They had shown that love was the greatest teacher of all, that faith could move mountains when combined with hard work, and that every person had worth and potential if someone just believed in them enough. And in the end, that was the truest lesson of all. Grace had taught Sunday school to frontier children. A cowboy named Ryder volunteered to help and learned about grace. And together they created a love story that became legend, inspiring others to believe that even in the hardest circumstances, with faith and determination and love, anything was possible.